For the first time in about 6.5 years, I'm not waiting for any games from Kickstarter. Let's yak a bit about why I've gone off crowdfunding just a bit. First of all, a really brief summary for those of you who might not be familiar with Kickstarter or crowdfunding. The whole concept of crowdfunding came about by people who said, we maybe want to create something to give to people or to sell to people, but we don't necessarily have the money or resources we need to make that. However, if we explain our idea, put our idea out there, say, this is what we want to make to sell, this is the amount of money we need to do it. Now, if everybody who's interested will pledge a certain amount of money, eventually we'll reach that threshold I need to make my thing, then I'll be able to produce it and get it out there to those people who pledged for it. Now, this has been used to create anything from video games to films to engineered items like a really fancy cooler to potato salad. Yes, there was one dude who was like, I'm going to crowdfund potato salad, haha. And then the media got wind of it, it went viral. The guy ended up raising $55,000 to make some potato salad for everybody. But I think the primary purpose was to give artists and creators in particular a chance to make their dreams come true, to create their thing and get it out there. So I think at least within North America, Kickstarter is the most popular crowdfunding site. There are others like Indiegogo, and I couldn't really name any others off the top of my head. And then in other countries and other languages, there are other sites that do similar crowdfunding things. But Kickstarter is sort of the big one that people seem to use most often. And it's certainly the one I've used most often. There's one or two items I think I got from Indiegogo a long time ago, but Kickstarter is what I primarily stick with at this point. And I've primarily used it to purchase board games. And board games have achieved a huge amount of success on Kickstarter. So they're actually some of the most successful Kickstarters that have been run. There have been board games that have brought in millions of dollars. Quite a few of the games in my own collection have come about through Kickstarter. And as I go through the points of this video, I'm going to be showing a bunch of those games. I also have games on my shelf, such as Near and Far here, that I purchased through regular board game shops, but that owe their existence to Kickstarter. So the very first thing I ever pledged for in Kickstarter was a board game called Kings of Air and Steam. I think that was way back in 2001 that I pledged for this particular game. And as you can see, I still have it on my shelf. I still think it's a really great game. And I personally have had a lot of success with the games I've pledged for. Over the past 6.5 years, I've purchased roughly 30 games, game expansions, and game accessories through Kickstarter. And a lot of those games remain on my shelf to this day, although I do regularly cycle through my collection because it's been so long since I really had any disposable income. I've always had to sell games that I currently have in order to fund the purchase of new games. But despite my frequent culling of the games that I have, a lot of the games, like Kings of Air and Steam, have remained on my shelf. I've heard horror stories of people who have pledged for games, who have given their money only to have something go wrong, and they've never received anything for that money they've given. But I've had a lot of success, and pretty much everything that I've purchased through Kickstarter I've enjoyed quite a lot. One thing I've been happy to do is support individual creators in helping them to bring their dreams to reality. And some of these board game designers have gone on to become successful board game publishers. So we have Viticulture and Tuscany, which are both excellent games that were designed by Jamie Stegmaier, who went on to start Stonemaier Games and has had a lot of success in the board game publishing business. There have been other folks such as Ryan Lockett, whose game Empires of the Void was also one of the first games I ever kickstarted, and who went on to start Red Raven Games. There's Cody Miller, who started Far Off Games, and there are other successes where I've done my tiny little bit to help them bring their dreams to reality and to achieve some kind of success within the industry. So it feels really nice to be able to support those individual creators who might not otherwise have had that opportunity. Now, as to why I am not currently waiting for anything from Kickstarter, I'm going to keep bringing games out here just to show as I talk through the points, such as Tiny Epic Galaxies and its expansion. But One big thing right now is simply the Canadian dollar. It is not doing well on par with the US dollar, which is the primary currency on the North American websites such as Kickstarter. Add that to the fact that over the past several years, the shipping costs have gone up dramatically, and you're in a situation where your Canadian dollar isn't going very far, and then you're paying shipping fees, which also really add to the cost of it. At the end of the day, it ends up becoming more worthwhile to wait for it to show up on the shelves of my friendly local gaming store here in Canada, and to pay Canadian prices without a shipping cost at all. In the past, it seemed that a lot of project creators on Kickstarter would advertise a price that was lower than MSRP in order to entice people to pledge and give their money early for a game that was yet to be produced. But a lot of people were discovering that if they waited for the game to appear on their local shelves, over time the prices would be discounted, and they would discover that the people who pledged for the game on Kickstarter were paying higher prices than the people who were waiting for them to show up on store shelves. So financially, it wasn't always a great decision for people, particularly when you take into account the fact that you're essentially loaning this company money to produce a game that you might not see for a year or 2 years or sometimes even 3 years down the road. There is one way that I used to offset this cost of shipping and Canadian dollars. And speaking of Canadian products, we have V Commandos with a couple of expansions from a designer in Quebec, Canada. And a lot of game designers used to offer group pledges where if you were able to get a group of people together to pledge for maybe 5 or even 10 copies of the game, they would discount the price of both the games and the shipping cost. So you could work together with other people to get a cheaper version of the game. The problem I found with that was, in the end, I was saving maybe $10 on my game, but I was driving all over the place to deliver the other copies to the other people who had gone in on the pledge. And there was a lot of driving involved, which at the end of the day was taking time and gas, and just the $10 savings wasn't really worth it for me. Now, as I said, board games have been highly successful on Kickstarter, and I'm going to bring out one huge success story. And it's a game that is my #1 favorite game of all time, and it's also currently #1 ranked on the site BoardGameGeek.com of all the tens of thousands of games they have there. And it was produced thanks to Kickstarter and the dream of one game designer. And that, of course, is Gloomhaven. Now here's one Kickstarter trend that I personally don't get, and that is a lot of the games that end up raising $2 million, $3 million are games that are full of plastic miniatures that essentially have a very high toy value for those who purchase the game. Most of these games heavily advertise the fact that they have all these miniatures in the game, and there seems to be less of a focus on the actual gameplay. Is it actually a great game? But no, we have all these beautiful looking plastic miniatures for you to play with, and maybe the gameplay is decent, maybe it's not, but look at all the stuff you get. And it's to the point where a lot of people will base their purchase decision on the cost per mini of the game. So it's like, okay, I'm paying $200 for this game, but look at all these minis I'm getting. Like, it's only $2 or $3 per mini. What a great deal. Meanwhile, a lot of these games will have entry points of $300 or $400 to get the actual game, and you can keep spending beyond that to get more of the extras that they might be offering. You see some games where you get into $600 levels or potentially higher if you want everything that comes with it, which for a single game, just I can't wrap my head around it. For me, that toy factor just isn't worth spending all that money. But having said that, I recently almost got sucked into purchasing a game on Kickstarter because of the artwork and the miniatures. There's a game called Arena the Contest, which is kind of a drab, unfortunate name, but I loved the artwork of it. I liked the look of the minis, and I almost purchased it because of that. The gameplay looked kind of interesting too, but it was another dungeon crawler style of game, and I thought, well, I already have Gloomhaven. I'm not going to play any other dungeon crawler over this game. So ultimately, I ended up canceling my pledge on that particular game. I didn't get all the pretty stuff, but even I'm susceptible to that way of thinking. Now, before I talk about my next point, let's bring out Flashpoint's an excellent cooperative game that I pledged for for a couple of the expansions anyhow. So speaking of games that upgrade their components, another thing I'm really not a fan of on Kickstarter are artificial stretch goals. So one way that a creator will entice people to pledge for their creation is to say, okay, if we reach this pledge level, we'll throw in these extra elements. If we get to the next level, we'll throw in these extra elements, and so on, in order to encourage people to keep putting in those pledges, to get those levels higher, to get more stuff in their game. I don't like that so much of these campaigns are pledge goal driven, though, to the point where a game designer will artificially pull out elements of the design, leave them out of the game, and say, you'll only get these if we reach a certain level with our pledge goals. Now, I do like and much prefer when a game designer will offer to upgrade the actual components of the game at higher pledge levels, to say, okay, if we bring in this much money, maybe we'll upgrade our resource tokens to nice shaped wooden tokens as opposed to little cardboard chits, or things along those lines, because then you don't feel like they're artificially keeping out actual game elements in order to try to convince people to get in on the project. Similarly, as I bring out the next game, which is a great group game called Deception: Murder in Hong Kong. So the other thing I'm not a fan of is exclusive content. So the other way that a designer might entice people to pledge is to say, we're going to throw in these little game elements that will be only in your games, and when they hit the mass market, those elements won't be in those games. Personally, I think that's kind of weird. I don't get the desire to have something that nobody else has or just a few other people have. It's not something that makes me feel good in any way, that's for sure. Between these two things of the kind of artificial stretch goals and the exclusive content, I would rather wait and see what the final game that comes out onto game shelves looks like before I decide whether or not to buy it. Because up until the point where the game actually funds, I'm just not quite sure what I'm getting. Here's another thing that grinds my gears. And speaking of cooperative games like Flashpoint, we also have another emergency services cooperative game called Police Precinct. Now, this one's a bit of a dilemma. There have been times where I have pledged for a game, I received the game, it was a good game, but because it was maybe produced by an individual or a very small team of developers, it had some issues. And then as people played the game and found the errors or the things that could be improved upon, the designer might have taken these suggestions and eventually produced a second edition of the game with improved rules, maybe some improved components even, and overall a better game. So in that way, the early adopters, the ones who loaned their money to bring this game to life, have kind of missed out on what ends up being a better version of the game. Yes, this also happens for established game publishers as well, but maybe not quite to the same extent as I've seen with the Kickstarters. A few examples of that are Empires of the Void, which really changed the game with its second edition, Exodus Proxima Centauri, which made a lot of really great changes to the physical components, Police Precinct, which changed some things. I have the second edition here, and there have certainly been others. But the dilemma there is, well, if everybody holds off and waits for a second improved edition, then there won't be a second edition because nobody will put their money to bring the game to life to begin with. So you need those early adopters, those people who are willing to take the risks to bring the game to life, and then maybe down the road it will become a better version of the game, or maybe, more than likely, it won't. But I find myself more and more just willing to sit and wait and see if a better edition of the game comes along, and I'm not rushing out there to be that early adopter initially. It's not like I don't have a ton of awesome games on my shelf to play already. And I guess I sort of hit upon this point already as I bring out Hardback, which is kind of a 2.0 version of a game I had kickstarted called Paperback. And so that's one example of a game where the first edition game was fun. There wasn't necessarily any reason to not play it, other than the fact that Hardback has a few things that I like a bit better than Paperback. But what I was going to say on this point was, yeah, I just don't feel the need to get a game necessarily ahead of its mass market release, let alone ahead of its kind of second edition printing if that thing ever happens. So I have lots of great games to play. Another point that I had sort of briefly touched on as I bring out an older game called Lost Valley, which is, I think, is still a pretty fun adventuring and exploring game. But I just don't necessarily have a ton of money to throw around or to lend to a game publisher who's working on a game that might come out in a year or two, because as a pledger on Kickstarter, you are paying that money up front for a product that has not yet been made and might be quite a long time before it ever gets made. So you're essentially giving a loan to this company for a future product, and I'm just not in a situation financially where I can give loans to people. Now, all that being said, I'm certainly not finished with Kickstarter and crowdfunding by any means. Part of it is just simply the fact that in the past while there hasn't been any game that's really grabbed me that's come up there. I do have pretty high standards because of the limited amount of money I have to spend. I have to be pretty picky about what I purchase. But if the right item comes along for the right price, and maybe if it's a smaller publisher that I can support, then yeah, I'll still be willing to purchase games through Kickstarter. One example is an expansion for this game, Villages of Valyria, that's currently on Kickstarter. It's called Villages of Valyria Landmarks, and I'm almost certainly going to pledge for that because this is such a great little game and it's been such a success for me. In fact, I have another video where I did a solo gameplay of Villages of Valyria, which I'll link below here. I don't necessarily see myself using crowdfunding to purchase games from any of the larger game companies. Not that there's really such thing as a huge board game company, with a couple of exceptions, I guess, like Hasbro and Asmodee now, but for the most part, board game publishers are very small businesses. But I'm more likely to get in on something that's helping to support the kind of smaller business person. So those are the primary reasons that I'm not currently waiting for anything from Kickstarter, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Are you still very active with Kickstarter, or are you kind of using it less than you have in the past? Let me know in the comments below, and I really appreciate you watching this video. Cheers! Hey, it's Josh. Thank you so much for watching. If you could crush that like button, pulverize that subscribe button, smash that notifications bell, and chuck this video at somebody you think would enjoy it, I would appreciate that a ton. Cheers! Oh, wrong shirt. Back in 2001. So the very first board game, I still think it's a really great game. I've kickstarted roughly 30 games, game expansions, and game accessories, and over the past 6.5 years, I've pledged for roughly 30. Over the past 6.5 years, I've pledged. Wait for it to show up on the shelves of my friendly local. So ultimately, ended up canceling my. In order to allow. Because up until the point where the spat was changed, I mean, part of it is certainly the fact that there's nothing. What do you call it?